Okay, welcome everybody. Very excited for us to have this event today, focusing on divestment for Palestine at the state level. I want us to center ourselves in these times. We live in times where any and all activism is under severe repression, and especially activism for Palestine, and especially divestment. These are times when there are hundreds of bills and many laws that already passed banning divestment, specifically for Palestine, and any kind of ethical investment policies, especially at the state level. At the same time, we see dozens of cities and unions and churches and institutions and foundations that are passing resolutions and decisions to divest or to adopt ethical investment policies and guidelines despite backlash, or maybe because of it. That means a swell of organizing. That means that we have thousands and thousands of organizers around the country and the world that care about where our money goes and trying to make sure that our public monies are not invested in corporations and entities that are directly involved in severe human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity, such as the Gaza genocide, such as apartheid in Palestine, Israel. So we have an amazing lineup of speakers today from 3 different campaigns in California, in Minneapolis, and in Washington that will tell us about their campaigns and their achievements in their campaigns so far, so we can learn from them. I will introduce the speakers as they go. Before we start, I wanted to tell everybody who joined us today that the chat is disabled. So if you want to ask any questions, you have a box in the bottom of your screen that is labeled Q&A. And if you click on it, you can type in your question. And I want to encourage you to type in your questions throughout this webinar so we can see them. And we will also have dedicated time at the end of this event today to answer any of these questions to all of you. We will also have a recording of this event that you will receive a copy of, including all the links, so no worries about that. So to start us off, we have 2 wonderful speakers from Minneapolis. Brian Cheval, who is a utility worker in Minneapolis, and Maeve Aiken, who is a writer and educator, whose work was published in Lux magazine and Dissent magazine. And both of them are organizers with the Minnesota Anti-War Committee, and they help lead the Divest Minnesota campaign. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to speak about divestment today. Our campaign is so indebted to the work and resource building of both AFSC and the BDS movement, so we're a little starstruck to be here. I'm Maeve, and alongside my comrade Brian, I'll be discussing the current status of the divestment movement in Minnesota. Brian and I organized with the Minnesota Anti-War Committee in a subcommittee dedicated to the Divestment campaign, which the AWC started developing in 2022. Our campaign's target is the 4-person State Board of Investment, which is chaired by Governor Tim Walz. In 1985, the SBI voted to divest from apartheid in South Africa in response to pressure from Black-led anti-imperialist organizations, including Friends for a Nonviolent World and the Minnesota Anti-Apartheid Legislative Coalition. The targeted investments comprised 12% of the $9 billion under SBI management. And today, the SBI invests 4%, or $5.6 billion, of its nearly $150 billion of holdings in companies that facilitate and profit from Israeli apartheid and genocide. Although SBI members often claim that only the legislature can make political decisions about their investment practices, we know that divestment from apartheid is within the body's power because the body has done so before. Furthermore, when they insist that they are lowly fiduciaries making apolitical decisions in the interest of public workers, we know that they're neglecting the thousands of public workers who have signed our divestment petition and the dozens of public workers who have demanded the divestment of their pensions at the SBI's quarterly public meetings. In 2025, the SBI held only one of those quarterly meetings in person, and it canceled two of them altogether. As a teacher with a pension managed by the SBI, I believe unequivocally in the right of workers to have pensions and to maintain autonomy over those pensions. The hard fought labor victories that produced Minnesota's current retirement system are undermined by the SBI's denial of our demands that our pensions be divested from weapons manufacturers who produce weapons that are used to kill our colleagues and their students in Palestine. In order to engage large coalitions of workers in our movement, we frame our divestment targets in four categories, which Brian will now elucidate.
Thanks, Maeve. Like Maeve said, we have these are the four categories that we use to divide our investments, and they roughly translate into like levels of complicity. And so it's Israel, weapons, construction/destruction, and the rest. Because we've taken like a large picture framing of divestment from Israel, categorizing these investments this way serves two important functions for our campaign: internal clarity and mass legibility. First, it helps us and our partners like think about magnitudes of complicity and thus have an understanding that, for example, $1 million in Israel bonds is bigger for us than $1 million in Microsoft. And that allows us to navigate the strategic twists and turns of the campaign without losing sight of the whole. Second, when educating people at protests, educational events, or like through social media, our communication, we can communicate this larger story with nuance in a relatively simple way. We want this to be gripping, functional information presented as simply as possible with like a path to actionable demands, not a heavy blob that leads to despair. We can go to the next slide. And that is so important that we are able to do that because while we go to the SBI's quarterly meetings and the goal is to get this institution to take these actions, our campaign is pointed outward, right? Building a mass movement is our fundamental task because we believe pressure for change comes from people taking up the demand and fighting with us, but also spreading it as a social question. To that end, it takes all kinds of methods, whether demonstrations, no matter the size, petitioning and tabling at events, teach-ins, even lawn signs and t-shirts to let those bodies do the talking. All those have helped us to bring it to the public and build awareness. We've done those things in the metro, but we also have made a point to bring them around the state with lovely groups in Rochester, Winona, St. Cloud, Duluth, and more. But also how we communicate is just as important, and it has to be flexible, right? If we have to understand that the point of unity we seek is this divestment, and then find ways to relate it to what people are concerned about. For example, during ICE occupation here in Minneapolis and Minnesota as a whole, we talked about how many of these same investments were being used to kidnap and brutalize our neighbors, and that divestment is a tangible action to attack the tools of the Trump administration. Um, these movements are complementary, right? And we shouldn't like tell people to look away from that and look at this, but we should tell them, or we should help people to see them together and even build a greater political understanding where U.S. imperialism is not like disconnected from the homeland. And divestment from Israel and its accomplices is divestment from this dystopian violence. Anyway, let's go to the next slide. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is about finding your allies, and we think this is like really essential for the campaign and its success. Minnesota has an incredible grassroots tradition, and we're blessed to work with so many of these groups. Some have even been in the fight for divestment longer than the AWC. We want to shout out the long contributions of the Minnesota BDS community and the Break the Bonds campaign. We have a lot of debt, but you can see many of the groups here that we've worked with: AMP, USPCN, Women Against Military Madness, Labor for Palestine, JVP, MIRAC. It goes on. And there's so many more than that. We've worked in coalition and collaborated on events, but we have also worked in parallel. Some groups have different strategies or angles that they prefer to bring the demand forward, but we see them all as complementary. As long as we're pushing in the same direction, we can create a better environment for everyone. Public workers are particularly important allies. These are their pension funds. One of the most important political points of the campaign is to stand and collaborate with public workers and their right to have and control their pensions. First of all, because we aren't reactionary freaks and we do stand with the workers, but also because they have the most leverage in this fight. They passed multiple resolutions here calling for divestment, and unions like MAPE and our friends in Educators for Palestine passed a resolution to create a task force on divestment for the whole of education Minnesota. That is huge. We believe mass organizational strategy and strong relationships with diverse groups are what have moved this campaign. And I'll pass back to Maeve to talk about the fruits of that.
Thank you, Brian. So the reason we were invited to speak today is that last October, a months-old Data Practices Act request that the Minnesota BDS community had submitted revealed that the SBI had divested $13.3 million of its holdings in Israel bonds, leaving only one $470,000 bond left in its portfolio. Although the AWC's position is that divestment from Israel is a moral imperative, regardless of potential adverse financial consequences, it's worth noting that all the bonds were sold at a loss, and thus the board's past choices to renew the bonds were negligent at best, and at worst sacrificed the viability of workers' retirement funds in the interest of maintaining public support for Israel. So when a Break the Bonds campaign forced the SBI into a public vote on a 2015 divestment resolution, the three SBI members who voted to continue purchasing Israel bonds prioritized their support for a settler colonial ethno-state above the financial futures of the very workers who had elected them. The SBI's choice to divest was a clear-cut victory for our movement, but since the body chose to do so outside the public eye, we recognize the necessity of controlling the media narrative through press conferences and agitprop. Based on the SBI's consistent insistence on its apoliticism, we correctly predicted that its members would describe the choice not as divestment, but as a disconnected series of calculations to sell and opt out of renewing the bonds for purely fiduciary purposes. Divestment from Israel bonds is a point of unity for a constellation of local groups struggling for Palestinian liberation. So we wanted to energize our base by emphasizing that sustained and principled grassroots organizing, it leads to victory, and it's our responsibility to normalize pro-Palestine action under Zio-American hegemony by claiming our victories. Our response required tactical adaptivity, in part because divestment didn't exactly look the way many of us envisioned it would. We're currently tapping into those same instincts as we build a community-responsive campaign specifically targeting investments in Palantir. Local familiarity with Palantir has skyrocketed this year as a consequence of our ICE occupation. And as many of you know, familiarity with Palantir not only breeds contempt, but also radicalization. This year, ICE agents used Palantir technology that had been incubated in Palestine to facilitate the abduction, surveillance, and detention of Minnesotans. The Divestment campaign is responding to this shift in organizing conditions by targeting Palantir as a divestment pressure point. As we continue demanding complete divestment from Israel, we're also spotlighting the specific violence Palantir's products catalyze in our educational materials and our addresses to the SBI. While connecting Palantir's operations in Gaza and its operations in the Twin Cities, we continue foregrounding our core belief that it is our responsibility in the belly of the beast to dismantle the economic tools of imperialism, regardless of the extent to which they are used against us. Another victory would further illuminate the SBI's ability to take ethical and political considerations into account while setting a valuable precedent for other state bodies and making the economic isolation of Israel and its corporate partners in crime feel possible in a country whose domestic and international policies are quite literally structured by Zionist logics. Thank you so much again for having us here and for taking the time to listen.
Thank you so much, Brian and Maeve. This is an incredible story that you tried to kind of condense for us in a short presentation. I will stay with you for another second, and I want to ask you, looking at your win here, yes, selling Israel bonds at a loss from the state Board of Investment, SBI, that controls the state retirement system. That's huge. Usually pension funds and retirement systems are notoriously hard to move. What do you think was the main thing that made them do that?
Personally, I think that it was like the connections with organized labor, that in the sense that I think that that is something that they can't ignore. I think that's a core constituency that they feel particularly threatened by. But I also think it was like I said, like building that campaign outward, when we were able to bring in people to the SBI's public meetings, they were terrified by that. And it was people like just going up and speaking to the board and like chanting about divestment, but that rattled them enough that they were, like Maeve mentioned, they closed down those public meetings, which they're legally required to have for over a year. Uh, and I think that it just shows that they were scared to look at this. And even like people who publicly try to present themselves as pro-Palestine, like Keith Ellison, I think they were like ashamed that they were afraid to move on that. So I think that coupled with the political reality that Israel bonds tanked in value, so they were particularly vulnerable. I think those three factors were the big thing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I also wanted to ask you very quickly, what did they say was the reason they sold it? Did they give any reason for it?
I'm not remembering the exact verbiage because it was so convoluted, but several local news organizations reached out to SBI members for comment, and they essentially depoliticized it and implied that it was fully like a fiduciary choice, that they weren't conscious of enacting divestment. And they kind of like framed the selling off of bonds as different from divestment, or not allowing them to mature or renewing them as separate from divestment, which felt like a kind of strategic, tactical way of eluding the narrative that we were trying to propagate.
Yeah, thank you so much, and congratulations to you and to all of us. And we will transition to the next campaign. State of Washington is officially the first state to have divested fully from Israeli apartheid, genocide, and occupation in its operating funds. So we're not talking about pension funds anymore, but about the state's own operating funds, its bank accounts. And to that story, I want to welcome Diana Fakouri, who is a Palestinian designer and artist and a co-founder of Washington for Peace and Justice, a Palestinian-led advocacy group, and a core member of Cut Ties with Genocide that led this fantastic campaign, the coalition that led this campaign. And now she's also the executive director of the Rachel Corrie Foundation for Peace and Justice. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. Let me get my slide shared. One moment. Okay, you guys can see that? Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about our win with the treasurer, in which he divested, or his office divested $62 million of Caterpillar bonds. But I also am going to be talking about our campaign more broadly. So first of all, some background information. Our campaign is made up of two organizations, Washington for Peace and Justice and JVP Seattle. I'm guessing most folks are familiar with JVP. Jewish Voice for Peace is the largest Jewish-led anti-Zionist organization in the world. By contrast, WA4PJ is a very small and scrappy Palestinian-led organization in Washington state focused on political advocacy. The main primary target of our campaign is the Washington State Investment Board. We want them to divest from companies complicit in the genocide, ethnic cleansing, and illegal occupation of Palestine. And the SIB, the Washington State Investment Board, I'll be referring to them as SIB because it's just easier. They have over $1.5 billion invested in companies complicit in the genocide. So I'm going to take you through a timeline of our campaign. So we came together about a year and a half ago. We very quickly identified the SIB as our primary target. Initially, we were looking at Israel bonds, and we found that the SIB doesn't have Israel bonds, but that they have all these other investments. And so we started to meet with members of the SIB to make our case with them, which at the time was sort of one about the moral case of just how brutal and horrible the genocide was. And we came to see that they don't really care, or like they started, many of them were saying, oh yeah, like personally I'm very sympathetic, but we have this legislative mandate to maximize profit with a prudent level of risk. So it became clear to us that we need to develop a new angle. Um, at the same time, we were advocating with the families of Rachel Corrie and Aishnur Ezgi Agi, who were two Washingtonians that were killed by Israel in Palestine, to try to get justice and accountability into their murders. And you'll see how it ties back in. So I'm gonna zoom into the treasurer divestment, and then I'll zoom back out to the broader campaign. So as we were starting to meet with the SIB members, the treasurer, our Washington State treasurer, is part of the SIB. So we met with him initially just to understand, to make our case and to understand his point of view. And in that initial meeting, we discovered that he manages this whole other, the operating funds of Washington State. This is another bucket of investments in our state. We also discovered that he was a proponent of ESG, or environmental social governance factors. He seemed to kind of see himself as a champion in that. And we found out that he doesn't have any Israel bonds. And in our conversation with him, it seemed pretty clear that he is pretty risk averse. So in that, it gave us like some good information about how we can proceed with him. After that meeting, it was actually Dove that put us on to the fact that even though they don't have Israel bonds, they might have corporate bonds like Caterpillar bonds that we need to check in with. So we followed up with the Treasurer's office to ask about their corporate bond portfolio. And when they replied, we discovered that they have tens of millions of dollars in Caterpillar bonds. So then we scheduled a second meeting with the treasurer, in which we had the direct ask of asking him to divest from Caterpillar. We laid out our argument of, Caterpillar's crimes in the West Bank and Gaza, made the connection to locally that, Caterpillar was the bulldozer that was used to run over Rachel Corrie in 2003, who again was a Washington resident that never received accountability for her murder. And in that meeting, we were trying to make the connection with Caterpillar and his ESG, his love of ESG, and making it clear that he's sort of missing the social part, the S part of ESG, in their filter. And so he promised us that he was going to take it to his team and to sort of review their ESG guidelines and see what they can do. So meanwhile, there was like a lot of back and forth, emails, whatnot. All of this was done internally, by the way, this part of our campaign. In December of last year, unbeknownst to us, the Treasurer's office started to sell off some of their Caterpillar bonds. They then created a renewed ESG memo. And after that, they made a full divestment of Caterpillar bonds. We got the news then in February of this year. And when we found out, we were like ecstatic, and then trying to like strategize and also keep it under wraps, which was really, really hard. And we met again with the treasurer to like develop our strategy and figure out like how to build on the relationship, thank him obviously, and figure out, how to frame it and move forward with the announcement. So now I'm zooming back out. I'm going to go back in time a little bit to last summer. That's when we officially launched our campaign. JVP Seattle, first of all, before that, they did an action Palantir and received some press for it, which I think brought Palantir up into like public awareness. And then through our like official launch and outreach that we were doing throughout the summer, we started to like grow momentum for our campaign. And then we have an amazing group within our campaign that is working with local unions throughout our state. And we started to have a lot of labor wins in which labor unions were passing resolutions to divest from genocide, essentially. And then we started to go to the SIB, testifying in front of the SIB and creating actions there, bringing a lot of people in to testify against the horrible companies that they're invested in. And then because the SIB wasn't moving, we decided to go forward with some legislation. So we started to build a really broad coalition of not just, our campaign focused on Palestine, but also organizations that are doing like housing rights, immigration rights, and environmental justice, other social justice stuff. And we created a bill that we dubbed the Responsible Investment Act that would require the SIB to adopt a responsible investment framework, which is basically an ethical framework, but we used responsible because we thought it might be less triggering for our legislators. We proceeded in the legislation. We had a Senate hearing and we testified there with our coalition. It was really amazing, but then the bill pretty much died at that point. Yeah. So then after the legislative season, or actually, I guess it was during, we found out about the divestment and we announced in March, we actually announced the divestment on Rachel Corrie's birthday to make that connection again. We received some great press about it. And then I also wanted to give a shout out to the city of Olympia because at around the same time, another internal campaign was working with the Olympia City Council and got them to adopt an ethical investment guidelines. So like two big wins kind of all at once. I just want to highlight that like after we announced, we had a big celebration and it was really amazing. And I think it's really important for us to like, just like bask in our wins because so much of this work is just a struggle. It can be really demoralizing to talk to people that don't care. So it was really fun and I encourage everyone to do that. So right now we've actually been on a little bit of a hiatus. We're about to regroup and re-strategize. I'm sure as we do that, we'll be like, working on building out our coalition and then going back to the SIB and potentially legislation if the SIB continues to not listen to us, which is probable. Some key takeaways I want people to think about. I was thinking about this, about our campaign as like, we've gone through this like cycle of like research and then like we think we have an angle, we find an angle and then we build relationships on that angle. But then as we're building relationships, like things change and we have more, then we go back to the research and kind of keep going back through this cycle. It's a really important one to just like not get stuck in what you think is the right course of action and to continue to find common ground and find allies and build on that. So that's pretty much it for me. Please stay connected with us. Everybody can follow us on Instagram. If you're a Washington State resident and you haven't signed our petition yet, please do so at our website. And then if you are a Washington organization, you can sign on to our coalition at futures-wa.org.
Wow, thank you so much, Diana. I was so ecstatic to hear about this win. I know, and I'm sure many others. And I really loved seeing that slide with the pictures from your party. And I wanted to ask you very quickly about that. We are in the midst of a genocide and quite a horrific one. And I know from other groups that achieve different achievements along the way. It's all along the way. It all kind of shrinks in comparison to what we hear in the news every day. What does it take to go out and party such an achievement?
Yeah, I love that question. I think that for myself, I've had to sort of like disconnect a little bit from the news. Like I want to stay informed and I do stay informed, but I'm not as basked in it as I was in late 2023. So it takes a lot. Like I think that a big part of our campaign, we've built these connections with each other with each other within the campaign. And it keeps us going because there are times where, like I said, like working in the political sphere is really demoralizing because these people don't care. It's what seems so obvious to us as citizens of conscience, like they just don't care about. And so it's really important that we sort of like lean on each other, and just like have fun. Like we've become friends. Like it makes the work parts of the work fun to be able to enjoy each other and enjoy the wins. Oh, you're muted, Dove.
I was saying this is what builds sustainability or sumud in our struggle, which we direly need. Thank you so much, Diana. The bad news about the Washington state win is that Washington is the first state to have divested in its operating funds from Israeli apartheid, genocide, and occupation, because whatever is left there is not on our BDS divestment shortlist. But as a California resident, that's bad news because that means California is not going to be the first. So let's switch to California because, first of all, that's where I live, but secondly, also because it is such a huge state with such immense investments. And actually, California has the largest socially responsible pension fund in the country, CalPERS. And I want to introduce our speakers from a fantastic campaign called CalSTRS Divest. CalSTRS is the state pension fund for the teachers across the state. And our two speakers are Christina, who is a Palestinian American educator in Berkeley, California, who has a master's in education from UCLA and over 10 years of classroom experience. She supports many Palestine-focused organizations and campaigns around us, including the Oakland People's Arms Embargo. Yoo-hoo! And she also performs traditional dabke dancing. And our second speaker is Andrea Pritchett, who is a public school teacher in Berkeley and a member of BFT 1079. Andrea is a veteran of the UC Berkeley South Africa divestment movement of the 1980s. And also a former volunteer with the International Solidarity Movement, who documented land confiscations in the West Bank town of Qalqilia, and in 2007 taught guitar and songwriting to girls at a summer camp in the Salfit area of the West Bank. I love this bio. This is so good. Both Christina and Andrea are founding members of CalSTRS Divest. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So we're gonna zoom through our presentation, I think. But I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much. It's been very inspiring and educational to hear from the other campaigns. I'm very happy to get to participate today. So just really quickly, want to go over like CalSTRS Divest, as Dove mentioned, is focused on divesting the teachers' public pension fund, CalSTRS. And so because it is a primarily educator pension fund, our membership of our organization is also made up of both rank and file union members and union leaders from two of the largest statewide teachers unions, which are California Federation of Teachers, or CFT, and the California Teachers Association. And we have members from all over the state. It is a very huge state, but we have people from Berkeley, Richmond, Oakland, San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles, San Diego, and now Eureka. And we also have K through 12 and community college volunteers, as well as volunteers who are not teachers who are supporting our campaign. We have the union support through endorsements and adopted resolutions of unions that represent over 200,000 educators who support divestment from Israeli apartheid and genocide. And we also have the support of over 50 grassroots and nonprofit organizations in different levels of involvement and support. And just a quick overview of demands. Our number one demand, obviously, is to immediately divest from all companies and bonds that enable, facilitate, and profit from the occupation of Palestine. Our secondary demands are to reinvest that money, to commit to a reasonable timeline for divestment, and to engage in transparency with stakeholders. So I'm going to pass it to Andrea.
Thanks, Christina. And thanks to everybody. Your stories really are inspiring. It's really great. It's very nutritious for us. So CalSTRS was created by legislation, over, I think it's like 100 years ago. It has a portfolio that fluctuates between 390, I think we hit over $400 billion in the past year. Right now it's somewhere around 390. About 1 million people in the state of California get either retirement, disability, or survivor benefits from the pension fund. And the majority of public schools, community college professors, and charter schools also pay into CalSTRS. So it's huge. The power, the decision-making power, because it was created by state legislation, the Teachers Retirement Board is dominated by the electeds. There's a 12-member board that make up the investment committee itself. Three members, some of them are union reps from CFT, California Federation of Teachers, or the California Teachers Association. One is a retired CalSTRS member. But look how many are appointed by the governor, and how important it is that the governor can tip the scale on whether or not these folks vote to divest or not. The board is advised and consults with the chief investment officer, currently a guy named Scott Chan, super influential in terms of what they decide and how they interpret their responsibilities under the ESG policies. But as we have learned that they are very doggedly into this fiduciary responsibility to members, and sometimes to an absurd, it's an absurd extreme. And in some of them, yeah. So the existing policy, the chief investment officer investigates investments that pose a risk to the pension, and the staff is supposed to engage with that corporation. We have filed Public Records Act requests, about companies like Palantir and so forth, and gotten nothing. Like, they've done nothing to investigate. And then they do this double-edged thing where they say, oh, well, we can't divulge due to confidentiality restrictions. So examples of corporate activities that, when violated, pose a risk to the portfolio and so are therefore grounds for investigation should be respect for human rights, civil liberties, respect for cultural and ethnic identities, wars, conflicts, acts of terrorism. All of those should be grounds to begin an investigation and an engagement process. Go ahead. So we do have precedents. So the idea of divesting is not unheard of. In 1986, they did divest because it was state mandated. So this is another reason why we should engage the state electeds. They could take action. In 2013, there was a process of divestment related to gun manufacturing companies, and likewise divestment of $12 million in two private prison companies. Relative to the $400 billion portfolio, these are pretty small, but they do provide us with precedents for this kind of activity. Next. The targets of our campaign, very similar. Yes, we decided that because the portfolio is so massive that we just picked out 4 companies and Israel bonds. Caterpillar, obviously, and congratulations to our comrades for their divestment. We also have Lockheed Martin. So we're going after arms manufacturers, those directly involved in the genocide. Elbit, an Israeli company. And we chose also Palantir because, again, as was mentioned by Brian in Minnesota, that the overlap between ICE and Palestine was not made Palantir an obvious choice for divestment. We also have the issue of Israel bonds. We have $28 million. That seems like a low number. We have to kind of keep checking, but currently $28 million. But the thing is it's so small. Why not? This fiduciary responsibility, getting rid of $28 million in Israel bonds is not going to risk the well-being of retirees. And what it demonstrates to us is that their commitment to failing Israel bonds is a political choice that they make. And so that's a point of leverage for us. Go ahead.
All right, so I'm going to quickly run us through our timeline of like how our campaign has kind of grown and changed. This started with actually even before summer 2024, an organization called Bay Area Labor for Palestine had an organizing event where they revealed, that someone had done this research and found out that our pension fund was heavily invested in the apartheid state. And so we also were like notified that like within CalSTRS, right, about how much of that money had been specifically in like weapons companies and Israel bonds. And so Berkeley Federation of Teachers, which is mine and Andrea's union, passed a resolution in support of BDS and encouraging CalSTRS to divest. One of our members tried to have it heard on a national level, but AFT executives were not hearing it. They actually like kicked her out of the convention, and all this other backdoor stuff happened to like prevent it from being heard on the floor. We decided to go back to like local organizing instead of jumping to the national. And so we've been basically reaching out to lots of different unions. We've really been focusing on teachers unions. So we pulled in members from local unions in the Bay Area and Los Angeles. And working together, we were able to get one of the second biggest teachers union in California to pass a divestment resolution in fall of 2024. What we did realize, though, is that it only passed when the entire whereas section was gutted, and that section provided narrative around what's happening in Gaza, around the genocide. And I've never seen a resolution where the entire whereas section is gutted before, but what we learned from that is that we're working within some pretty liberal institutions. And while they do want to appear that they're on the right side of history, it is an uphill battle to get them to take a strong stance. They did send a letter to the board. We also have a representative from that union who sits on the board that we've been able to be in communication with. But we're also learning that like access does not necessarily mean influence, right? And so we launched our campaign like more in person in spring of 2025, where a bunch of us traveled to Sacramento to have a press conference and speak at the board meeting. We've had pretty consistent presence at their board meetings since then. We've also been learning that traveling to different cities is extremely important for our campaign, and it's so hard because California is so big. But several of us were able to go to San Diego to build with San Diego educators, and we were able to bring in more San Diego organizers from a rally that we did there. Our communication with them has went from like an outright denial to meet with us through this letter that they published with their letterhead saying that they don't believe in divestment and that they have to, protect the market and their investment returns. But in response, we published this report that really exposes their investments and makes it difficult for them to deny their culpability. As Andrea mentioned, we've been putting in some public records requests. There's not much really to show, like as if they're not really doing anything about it. We've also just been building pressure through, like, we've done one really big statewide action where there were banner drops in 4 cities. And we pulled in lots of union leaders into a specific board meeting that caused the board to break ranks with their staffers and actually say, yes, we'll meet with you, even though they had previously said they won't meet with us. So we did get a meeting with the investment staff, and unfortunately, it seemed that they were very committed to, denying that like Israel bonds are a risk and committed to this quote unquote fiduciary responsibility. tried to talk circles around us. So that was difficult. And so since then, we've really been focusing on continued public presence at their board meetings, and also doing just trying to keep up sustained pressure. So in doing that, we have this like weekly half-hour power hour that we recently launched where we try to get people to send personalized emails by like we have people meet at their school sites, we're tagging them on social media, we're having new people sign the petition, we're having people send repeated emails to CalSTRS to show that like we're not going away. And we've also been thinking a lot about how the electoral state of in California really matters for the CalSTRS board and how they make decisions. And so we recently endorsed Megan Adams running for state controller, and we're thinking about like how we can start to throw some weight behind getting an ally onto the board. So generally speaking, our strategy is really about creating internal crisis within CalSTRS between their staffers, their board, damaging their reputation as a supposedly progressive public pension, and then, of course, building a base of CalSTRS members through union support, labor support, and also public support, but really focusing in on educators who are the main stakeholders. And then, of course, raising the political consciousness of the masses to really popularize and normalize divestment and ethical investment. So I'm going to let Andrea wrap us up here.
Well, we don't have much time, but yes, we have had some wins in terms of our growth and so forth. I guess I want to go to the critical questions if you can, because the critical questions for us has to do with this inside-outside strategy, which we've seen these other campaigns have wrestled with and negotiated. We have a membership. People are chomping at the bit to do big demonstrations and shutdowns and direct actions, and yet we're also trying to navigate the halls of the inside of the board and looking for allies in there. So we're excited to hear in the Q&A a little bit more about how you all view that tension and that sometimes contradiction. We do have wins. We feel like the creation and the infrastructure that we built is positioning us well, but there's more to go. There's more to do. Thanks for letting us go a little over.
It's preferential treatment to my
Hey, go Callie.
thank you so much. I want to just bring it all together and say we wanted to present something about like the state of state divestment. And I think what I hear from these presentations is a little bit about how we can win when we can work through the administrative channels, get the treasurer to sell something and then tell the public that it is all about some fiduciary risk. But that's good because that means our job is to create that fiduciary risk. We know that Israel bond is not a good investment, and we know that investment in Northrop Grumman or Caterpillar is a source of huge controversy. That's also a fiduciary risk, as I think the treasurer in the state of Washington said. So this is one route. When we look at huge pension funds like CalSTRS, what we need is what we're hearing from you both. This level of the scope of state level organizing in such a huge state. This is a kind of this is the kind of movement we need to build going forward. I want to transition us now to the Q&A part of our webinar, and to invite my comrade and friend Olivia Katbi, who is the North America liaison for the Boycott National Committee of the BDS movement, to take it away.
Thank you, Dov, and thank you to our panelists. Really great, inspiring presentations. I'm glad you brought up that element, Dov, of financial risk, fiduciary risk, because that is a question that a few people have asked, and it's a question that we get all the time related to divestment campaigns. Someone asked, I'm a retired teacher from the St. Paul, Minnesota public schools. My pension invests in the genocide, and they say they cannot divest without endangering their fiduciary duty. How can I get traction? And I know, Dov, like you mentioned, the Washington State treasurer, when they made the decision to divest, they pointed to all of these other recent divestment from Caterpillar by various funds, saying that is clear evidence of fiduciary risk. This is a risky investment. And so divestment was the thing that made it risky. So like these wins build on each other. But Dov, maybe you can start by answering this question. Like in general, what do you say when people ask you how, like, what do we say when they say that it's their fiduciary duty to be invested in these companies? And someone else asked, like, how do you balance placing more emphasis on the fiduciary argument versus like the moral argument?
Thank you. That is, I think, at the center of these campaigns. This is one of the main things that we are working through. So one way to look at it is we have ethical considerations. We have external costs. You know, if we as a society invest in weapons companies and fossil fuel companies and human rights violations and AI war machines, then this will come back and bite us in the butt. So whatever returns you get in the short term cannot outweigh the huge harm that is done to our communities and to life on planet Earth. So that's one kind of fiduciary argument that underlies most of the socially responsible investment industry, which is huge. It's like trillions of dollars. However, what we see happening right now is kind of a defensive strategy that is practiced because I think fiduciaries see Palestine as a highly volatile topic and very divisive. And because these pension funds, of course, serve many people who might not be in agreement with us. And also because of the very vicious attack by the federal government against any kind of ethical investment criteria. So they protect themselves by saying, oh, this is just about the value of the investment itself. And even if you just focus on that aspect of fiduciary duty, which is a very limited aspect of it, the short-term returns of these investments, even then we hear from the Washington treasurer that Caterpillar is not a good investment. Some of the largest pension funds in the world have divested from it, and some of the smallest pension funds in the world, the Alameda County they actually quote that Alameda County, California has divested from Caterpillar. Yoo-hoo, my county. And that creates risk. That means that this investment itself is risky because others do not want to be invested in it. And that's a risk we create. And this is our job, to create that risk.
There was a question for the Minnesota folks. How did you get contacts for all of those who receive state pensions? This is from someone in Oregon, my comrade Maxine, asking about, we have this campaign in Oregon, and Maxine's asking, how can we reach out with information to all of these different pension recipients in the state?
We did not get the contact information of the pension holders. It was like, again, it's a part of like building the campaign outward and in public and in connection with other groups, is that then like the people come to you, or if there just becomes like greater awareness, like they might actually organically find it like through like conversation or something like that, and contact the group. So yeah, it's just kind of like leveraging like the existing contacts and knowledge base that you have, like maybe looking up which pension funds and what like departments would fall under it, so that you just have know like what jobs are more likely to be a part of it would help with that. But really, it's just making yourself visible and talking to as many people as possible to define those.
Just to quickly add on, I also think this is part of where the value of coalition organizing comes in. And I think we're particularly predisposed to that kind of work in the Twin Cities because compared to, California, for instance, like our organizing base is a lot smaller. And so we just need to have that community on the left throughout various organizations struggling towards similar goals. Where like Brian and I were marshaling at May Day yesterday, and that was not an event that we had planned. It was one our organization had endorsed. And you make those labor connections when you are standing up for organized labor. You make those connections, you meet the union reps, you meet people who are organizing within their unions when you're regularly showing support for them, and not just kind of in the digital space, but by showing up to their actions, to their picket lines, by marshaling their protests. That is how you can start to make those organic connections.
I don't know if the California folks want to add anything to that. No?
No. You guys answered it really
Okay.
well. Sorry.
And then there was another question directed at the Minnesota folks, but I think all of you can answer this if you think of something that you'd like to say, which was what were the most significant obstacles that you faced and how did you overcome them?
For us, I think like two of the biggest obstacles would be making the campaign digestible, which was just like done over time of like whittling it down because it was a very research intensive thing and a lot of data and lists and stuff. And it took many or a few iterations of the campaign and our presenting of it for it to be something that people got it, but for people to really be able to run with it. And I think that that's just like a it seems like all the other campaigns are already at a very good place about that. The other thing was when the SBI decided to just shut out the public from meetings or to not hold them at all. Like I said, that isn't like the entirety of our campaign strategy, but that is a huge quarterly thing and a huge like outlet for the people who support this and want to be a part of it to feel like there's motion on. Um, so it was a process of like trying to like make requests about why they're like violating the law, but also having demonstrations when they held like Zoom meetings. We would demonstrate outside the State Board of Investment building, the Minnesota State Retirement Systems building, or when we staged a sit-in when they decided to do a hybrid one before coming back to the normal ones. So those are just the challenges of like how do you keep the energy going when somehow they're allowed to break the law and no one's going to ask them any questions about why they're doing it, or they can kind of like weaponize political stuff. Like they would say that they weren't holding the meetings because of the assassinations of politicians in Minnesota, but they ignored the fact that they had already started shutting down the meetings months before and quarters before. So it's like it's trying to counteract those narratives, but never actually like losing steam. And I think that the fact that we organized outside of those meetings made it so that we didn't actually have to figure out new things. We just had to double down and continue the stuff that we were doing, so that that wasn't our only lifeline or our only source of oxygen.
Yeah, and I think strategic escalation was crucial to navigating that obstacle where you talked about the sit-in and like a bunch of us got arrested and our community was so beautiful in how they showed up for us and the next meeting was in person for the first time in a year. So I think choosing those moments to escalate is critical and having the community and infrastructure where you know you're going to be cared for is also crucial. Unfortunately, we couldn't attend the meeting because we're banned from the building. But it felt like we were able to navigate the obstacle by thinking outside of the paradigm of what we had been doing up until that point.
Yeah, for California, real quick, just in terms of challenges, I think that we mentioned one big challenge is the geography of California just being such a huge state. And so being able to attend board meetings, like our constituency are teachers. They're working all day, and the board meetings are always on weekdays and they're always from 9 to 5, right? And so it's actually really hard to get teachers to show up to the board meetings, even phoning in because they're like in class and stuff like that. So being able to participate in their board meetings and get things on public comment is a bit of a challenge. And so we have to rely on people who are physically, geographically closer to where they have those board meetings. And people have to take days off work to be able to do that a lot of the time. So I would say that's one challenge. And then a second challenge, Andrea, I think is, trying to navigate inside outside strategy where y'all were able to get these successful relationships with your treasurer or whatever. And then for us, it's been a little bit more challenging to get an inside track into, or a champion who's on the board who's actually willing to do something about this. It seems like they really want to appear like they care, but no one actually wants to go out on a limb and like do something about it, right? And so our challenge here is finding that leverage point that like pushes them to a point of like they're pressured enough where they feel like there's urgency, where they know they can do something about it, but that they actually feel the urgency to actually do something about it. Andrea, is there anything else you want to add in terms of challenges and how we're overcoming them?
Yeah, I feel like one of the challenges is sort of a remnant from the anti-apartheid of the South Africa movement, which is this notion of constructive engagement. That was used, the Sullivan principles and this idea of like, well, if we engage with companies, if we engage with the apartheid regime, we can influence it from within. And that, so what we have today, these ESG policies, are actually kind of a buffer to prevent change. That they say, well, we've got these policies, so we'll let you know, and then there's nothing going on there. And so the question is, do we change the ESG policies? Do we who enforces when CalSTRS doesn't abide by its own policies? Who's the enforcer? Do we do a lawsuit? Do we try legislation? Do we shut the thing down? This is anyway. So that I find that to be quite a challenge, because it gives the appearance, the illusion of conscience, but it's not there. So
I'm gonna go to Dov, who I know has a lot of experience with this argument about whether or not to engage with these companies, and then I also want to hear from Diana about any challenges you faced in Washington.
Thank you, Olivia. We've been hearing these arguments about engagement versus divestment for many decades, as Andrea said correctly. And in fact, we have very simple answers to these that are not our answers, but the answers of the socially responsible investment community, and mainly the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And in a nutshell, we have a lot written about that, but in a nutshell, a responsible investor such as CalSTRS, they call themselves responsible investors, they need to engage with companies they are invested in. They have to engage with them in order to make them better. This is part of their mission in the world. And they should do that because if these companies don't change their conduct, in a way, they are themselves complicit in the same war crimes and crimes against humanity these companies are involved in. In a case of companies such as, I don't know, Palantir or Caterpillar, no engagement will change these companies' conduct. And we can prove that. We can prove that, for example, because we have a 20-year history of engagement with Caterpillar on these issues. So in a way, when an investor claims to being in an engagement process with one of these companies, either they're not, and they're lying, or they are engaged in something that is performative and has no bearing on their responsibility for these crimes. So legally speaking, there is no more option to engage with such companies. It's another level of complicity than just any other company that we know is involved in some way in those crimes. That's why we keep a tiered database of companies. It is called Investigate, investigate.info. You can read about each and every one of these companies and its complicity on the website. And we pick the worst of the worst, the ones that are really not targets for engagement, to be on our BDS divestment shortlist.
Diana, do you want to talk about any obstacles that you all have faced in Washington and how you overcame them?
Yeah. So one of the biggest obstacles was actually the win itself. Like after we won, I think that a win is very similar to a challenge or a setback, because then you have a lot of like differing ideas on how to proceed. And especially because there was so much excitement. And then also, like, the information was very sensitive and we didn't want it to leak. We wanted to be able to control the narrative. There were like differing points of view of like who to bring in or who to tell. And, So it created a lot of friction internally, which was, we've worked through it. We've since worked through it. But it was just like another added thing on top of like the stress and excitement of dealing with the win was like just like some internal friction. And I think that one thing that I would maybe like caution people about as they approach, hopefully like all of us are making more and more wins as we go, is to be really clear about decisions, like who gets to make what decisions in your campaign. I think that might have alleviated some of the challenges.
That's super helpful. Thanks for bringing that up. Andrea, did you have something to add?
Well, I just wanted to thank you for that. I just wanted to circle back to Dove's statement. So when you see that they're not engaging, when you see that that's not happening, do we have any precedents or any like what have people done? What have other campaigns done when it's very clear that they're not following their own policies? Like which way forward now?
Here we go back to your query, Andrea, earlier about the inside-outside strategy. You're absolutely right. We need to create the political will for them to take action. There is no way we can force them otherwise. And at the same time, try and make the ask very, very specific, like you have done in your campaign. On the one hand, we want them to divest from Israeli apartheid and genocide as a whole, but as a first step, we're telling them, come on, Caterpillar, it's a non-brainer. Palantir, come on, you have to do that. And that makes sense because it helps create that political will to divest from these specific companies. When it comes to engagement, one common practice in the industry is to publish an engagement report that we can demand that they would actually give us some transparency, the public, we, the investors in this fund, of how our money is used for leverage with those companies, if they claim that it is being used that way. It doesn't have to be a very detailed report, but it does have to say we have engaged with 15 companies, including this and that, and to create some timeline for engagement. That's also common practice. You engage with a company for a year, for two, for three, and if you don't see them moving, then you have to divest.
And is that information confidential? Like, are they allowed to refuse to disclose it?
Well, usually the actual details of a corporate engagement are confidential. They are private because that allows for this engagement to be fruitful. But the fact of the engagement often isn't. So the fact that they are in touch with some companies and talking to them could be made public.
And there's one more question that I want to bring up because I know that this is another one that you get all the time, Dov. How do I find out what local pension funds are investing in? I'm in small town Wisconsin.
Well, I can offer two ways ahead, or maybe even three. The first one that I just want to put out there, we have a weekly session dedicated to supporting such campaigns. It is called the BDS Office Hours, and I will put the link in the chat and also send it out with the recordings to everybody who signed up for this webinar. So if you have a campaign, and you have specific questions that involve research or strategy, we can try and help, no promises. Second answer is sometimes you don't need to know what they're invested in. That's also important to know. Some campaigns get really bogged down in trying to do a lot of research before they launch, and maybe it's not necessary. If you can find out whether or not they have any kind of ethical standards or limitations or screens on what they can and cannot be invested in, that's very important. Because in most cases, if a pension fund does not have any criteria that what they would not invest in, that probably means they're invested in everything. They are invested in some very widespread index funds that are invested in all the large companies on the US stock exchanges.
And I just want to add that cities are different than pension funds. Like the city fund is different than a workers' pension fund at the state level or even at the city level. And those are different divestment campaigns. And usually cities are publicly disclosing what they are invested in. It's on their website, but that's different than a pension fund.
Yeah, ours does. The SBI does just like publish a twice a year like public asset listings, and I really do agree with the idea. Don't get like bogged down in trying to know everything before you start doing anything. But the campaign did start by me like pulling up the sheet and going one by one between like a list of like complicit companies and cross-referencing it by hand. So if you just set like a few of them out for yourself of the ones you really want to know about or whatever, and you're able to find those public asset listings, they'd probably be published under like reports or something in the state or in the pension funds. So I would try that.
All right, we are going to leave it there. I put my email address in the chat. If you didn't get a question answered or you want to get connected with one of the speakers or anything, please feel free to email me. It's olivia@bdsmovement.net. We will send out the recording of this webinar as well as all the links that were mentioned, including the link to the BDS office hours and AFSC's resources on divesting, and any links that the panelists would like to include. I know that the CalSTRS campaign has several upcoming dates that they want to share with you all if you would like to help them take action. So we will include all that in the email. If you registered, you will receive the email. And yeah, I just want to say again, thank you to our panelists. It was super inspiring hearing from your different campaigns. And yeah, the BDS movement was founded in 2005, and we are sort of just now getting to this like breakthrough point in the US where we're having these historic wins. And so it's really exciting to be in shared struggle with you all.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. This was an honor.
Thank you all. Great work, everyone.